Thanks very much. So, as Valerie said, I work for a project called Feminist Communities for Climate Justice. It's a joint project between the National Women's Council of Ireland and Community Work Ireland. And we aim, as Valerie said, to put like a feminist and intersectional lens on climate impacts here in Ireland. But our work does obviously take in the global to local lens. And I'm hoping to kind of highlight intersectional feminist climate justice today. So I will kick off. So I'm sure lots of people and our speakers probably have like, definitions of climate justice or what they consider climate justice to be. I'm going to just use the definition that we have on our own project, just for kind of the sake of like, keeping consistency throughout the presentation. And for us, climate justice recognizes that the impacts of climate change and climate breakdown will not be felt evenly, and that those in society who are already disadvantaged or socially excluded will face more negative impacts. And achieving climate justice means that we can't kind of see climate and social justice as two siloed pieces of work to be done. We need to tackle these issues at the same time. We need to recognize and reduce inequalities in our society, as well as reducing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Importantly, we should do this to create a greener world that is also fairer and more equal. And ultimately, that doesn't mean we can just slap low carbon label on everything and continue business as usual. It means creating systemic change rather than, again, greening the business as usual model, which is why we often hear at climate protests, system change, not climate change. Otherwise, then we create a society which is like, we're net zero, we reduced our emissions, but we still have social injustice, and we should aspire to far better than that. We like to say that climate change is a threat multiplier or an exacerbator of existing social inequalities, meaning it escalates social, political, and economic tensions, particularly in fragile and conflict affected settings, but it can also bring on those types of kind of feelings to settings. In our own feminist climate justice report, which we published last April as one of the outputs of our project, we named 5 dimensions of climate injustice, really. And what we say is that marginalized and socially excluded groups in the face of climate change have contributed the least greenhouse gases causing climate change, are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, tend to be burdened by climate policy to tackle climate change. They're also least likely to see the benefits of those climate policies, particularly if they're things like tax breaks or discounts for early adoption, because that often means it comes with a certain level of disposable income to be an early adopter of things like retrofitting or electric vehicles. And most importantly, they also do not have their voices heard in decision-making spaces and are also less likely to be in those spaces. So we have strategies and policies and so on designed without their input and without their experiences at the heart of them. For us, we use a feminist climate justice approach and a community development approach, which I'll elaborate on a little later. But for us, feminist climate justice is about paying attention to the gendered and intersectional characteristics of all dimensions of climate justice. So those 5 dimensions that I just went over, thinking about the gendered implications of those and the intersectional implications of those. And throughout the presentation, I think there's only 2 or 3 in this one, but you'll see these little pink bubbles. And these are actually responses from community outreach that we did in the first year of the project when we asked people about what would climate justice mean for you and your life. And this particular one says, leaving no one behind and reaching the furthest behind first, listening, responding to communities who will have to adapt. Really, in our work, what we like to do is tie climate change to the very immediate needs and immediate areas in the lives of communities. So we talk about things like housing, access to public transport, access to good quality, healthy food, and so on. And so housing is such a topical issue, particularly in Ireland right now, that's the one that we use to kind of really connect climate justice to people's everyday lives. And in our own work as well, we always use an intersectional approach in our own work, and we also advocate for it to be used at all levels of climate decision making. And we need to consider how multiple disadvantages can interact and create unique challenges and impacts in the face of the climate crisis. And these are just a few examples of communities who might be already marginalized or who might be particularly disadvantaged or impacted by not only climate change, but also policy that doesn't pay adequate attention to existing social inequality in our society. And as well as just continue considering these groups on their own, obviously a big piece of intersectionality is the fact that we inhabit lots of different identities at once. So here's just one example that's quite typical of Ireland anyway. Like an older woman, like she might be disabled, living in a rural area, and she's far more likely to suffer from some kind of socioeconomic disadvantage. And so considering how we go from considering just these little siloed communities to considering that many of us will inhabit multiple identities and therefore in our current system, multiple forms of disadvantage at the same time. So on the global scale, when we're talking about kind of contributors to current climate change, we know that richer countries in the global north have contributed the bulk of greenhouse gases causing global climate change, and that countries in the global south are seeing the worst impacts of the climate crisis, but have contributed very little in comparison to the emissions that are causing climate change. And inequality in resources and money to adapt and defend against climate change impacts are caused due to historical and ongoing global power imbalances between the global north and south, and particularly the legacy of colonialism and what we call neo-colonialism, which is really the impacts of colonization still being felt to this day by many countries. And it's easy enough to kind of spell this out in words, but there's this website I really love called carbonmap.org, which is an interactive map of the world. And if you take a look at it and ask it, well, who are the current highest emitters in the world? And you can kind of see, you know, you've got America and Europe and you've got China quite big here as well. But I think a big piece that many people don't maybe not realize about climate change is that the emissions that are causing the climate change we're experiencing right now are historical emissions. So these are emissions from back in like the 1800s, around the times of like the Industrial Revolution, when we are really starting to pump coal and emissions into our atmosphere. So if you ask carbonmap.org, well, who are the historical emitters? Who are the ones most responsible for the emissions that are in the atmosphere right now? It suddenly looks very different in that America and Europe become huge, and you see countries like China start to shrink down a little here. And always noting that the likes of South America and Africa are quite small in comparison. And then finally, if you ask carbonmap.org, where are the most vulnerable people to the impacts of climate change right now? The map suddenly looks very, very different again. And just considering who's responsible for the emissions that are causing that right now compared to the size of the countries where we're seeing the most vulnerability, you see America and Europe have gotten very, very small, but you see a lot of vulnerabilities in the likes of Northern and Eastern Africa and in India and in China. So just always considering that when we're talking about who's emitting right now, but also who is responsible for the bulk of emissions that are in our atmosphere from historical kind of pumping of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then taking it from the global down to the kind of local scale, even in wealthier countries of the global north, who are largely responsible for climate change right now, there are marginalized communities with less power to emit as much greenhouse gases, to defend themselves from climate impacts, to be again in those decision-making spaces and to have their experiences recognized. And this is also true of countries in the global south where we see vast wealth inequality. And so a concept that has come up in kind of global in climate justice spaces to talk about this is MAPA, M-A-P-A, which stands for Most Affected People and Areas. And this concept allows us to discuss climate change and climate justice on a local and global level. So acknowledging inequality on a global scale and inequality within countries when discussing the climate crisis, because it's very important to note that inequality within countries, particularly when we're talking about wealth, is growing now at a faster pace than equality between countries. Wealth, again, the key factor. If you have money, if you have disposable income, you're able to better protect yourself. You're able to move out of harm's way in the face of climate change. But also, the wealthier you are, regardless of where you live in the world, the more carbon emissions your lifestyle produces. And so when we talk about kind of groups who climate change unevenly impacts, those MAPA groups can include countries in the global south, poorer people in the global north and south, women and girls, people of color, disabled people, indigenous communities, traveler and Roma communities, LGBTQI plus people, older people, and children and younger people. And specifically, our project, I'm going to talk today about women and girls because we do focus quite sharply on gender, but talking about women in all of their diversity as well. And I've tried to pick out some global and local kind of pieces about the impact of climate change on women and girls, with kind of quite a sad fact being that the majority of deaths related to extreme weather events around the world are women. And this is up to 5 times the rate of men. And in the face of climate change, again, when we're talking about that threat multiplier, that exacerbator of existing inequality, women and girls face increased vulnerabilities to all forms of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, human trafficking, child marriage, and other forms of violence. It's also a fact that the world's poorest people are disproportionately women, which leaves them with less of a safeguard to recover from loss of resources essential to their livelihoods, such as their home or their land. And climate change, like I said, will exacerbate existing gender inequality. But if we're not paying attention to gender when we're writing our adaptation or mitigation strategies, then we write strategies that don't actually attend properly to the needs of women and girls and can actually make, again, the transition retain gender inequalities or retain sexism. And particularly for women and girls, the culturally gendered work of care and caregiving and as resource collectors, whether that is going to get food directly from the land or going to get food from a shop or a supermarket, it means they experience environmental degradation differently to men and boys. Because care work is key to how women and girls worldwide experience and are impacted by the climate crisis, because caring roles are linked to resource procurement. Basically, we're talking about how you get food, how you use your energy, the transport choices you make, the security choices you make, and climate change and environmental destruction impacts the provision of care because it impacts how you procure or use all of these things. And this essentially genders climate change impacts. Our own project's definition of care work includes both paid and unpaid care work, including care work as paid work in the care sector of the economy, involving things like social care, childcare, and healthcare, including care work which is paid but carried out maybe in less formal settings like the care recipient's home. But we also talk about unpaid care work carried out in families and communities, including care for family members, neighbours, and networks of friends. And just to kind of throw a few examples of kind of the gendered care climate impacts that we might be talking about, because it is quite, for a lot of people, this isn't an area that isn't considered a lot, maybe in typical climate circles. For example, we know that a lot of women champion the use of public transport and active transport, walking and cycling, and they're more likely to use it than men. But also when we talk about trying to make those types of journeys work with caring journeys, and we find that a lot of public transport infrastructure all over the world has been designed with the needs of like the male breadwinner in mind, and there's poor compatibility with caring journeys. Just one example put here is try getting a pram or a wheelchair onto a crowded bus, tram, or train. We're talking about elevators or lifts or escalators being out of order. And we're talking about, at the end of the day, if public transport isn't child friendly to use, then it's immediately more cumbersome for somebody who is caring for children to use. We also talk about implications of energy use in the home related to care work, and this is where our energy use is most immediately billable. So when we see fluctuations in prices of energy, it's poorer households who are hit the hardest, but we also know that women and girls throughout the world are far more vulnerable to energy poverty, the inability to adequately heat or power your home compared to men and boys. Climate change, the kind of more typical example we see impacting crop or food growth, whether this reflects as price increases in supermarkets, where women will feel the cost as the main budgeters of households, or whether you are the person who is literally growing food off of your land and suddenly the growing seasons are completely changed because of climate changed and caused weather. Women are also more likely to go hungry when food is scarce so that their children can eat. Um, Due to the gender pay and gender pension gap, it's far harder for women to recover property or resources lost due to flooding or storms, which makes caregiving far more difficult, but it also leaves them with less of a base to kind of recover in the aftermath of these events. And things like fetching firewood, fetching water, growing crops are all impacted and made more difficult by the changing climate, such as further to walk or in hotter or more inhospitable conditions. And just to kind of tie back to the missing voices piece of the title of this webinar, at COP29, the UN climate conference, only 8 of the 78 world leaders who participated were women. So you're seeing the climate policies are being written largely by men, and decisions about climate change and how we tackle climate change on a global scale are largely decided by men. And the absence of women in decision making for at all levels, whether it is local or all the way up to the global, results in blind spots in policy making, which can vary from poorly compatible adaptation strategies to outright tragedies in the wake of natural disasters. And we also have to think about socio-cultural ideas about gender when we're thinking about the impacts of climate change. So, like, for example, is it appropriate or important for women to learn how to swim in a particular culture? Is it appropriate for them to go to school or work? Are they expected to put everybody's needs before their own? Are they the ones solely in charge of child rearing? Are they allowed to mix in the same spaces as men? Is it seen as proper for them to go into decision making? When there's economic crises, are they the ones who are expected to leave their jobs to look after children, and so on and so forth? And inclusion and consideration of women and girls within climate policies and financing is still very limited, and it doesn't address the full spectrum and impacts of gender inequality, such as unpaid domestic and care work, poor access to healthcare, or gender-based violence. And I just wanted to illustrate here just kind of, again, that intersectional nature of the impacts of climate change, but just some examples from Indigenous communities, for older people, and for Black communities in America. And then there's a piece here again in the upper left corner about the impact of climate disasters on women and children. And again, just thinking about all of these communities and thinking about, like, you know, the kind of aspects of the green transition. Can these people access public transport? Can they purchase an electric vehicle? Are they entirely reliant on things like agriculture to sustain their lifestyle? Do they have disposable income and time to learn about the climate crisis and its impacts? And are they properly represented or considered in climate decision making at all of those levels? So just to always be thinking about that in our practice. And finally, just in our own work, how we always strive to continue using our intersectional climate just community work approach. Try saying that 3 times fast. We use a feminist community work approach in all that we do, which is based on feminist values and on community work and community development values. So that's proper participation, non-tokenistic participation, valuing care, community empowerment, intersectionality, collective action, human rights, social justice and sustainability, and equality in all that we do. And we create accessibility at all our events. We only use accessible venues for in-person events. We use Irish Sign Language or ISL interpretation for online and in-person events. We also try to use our platform and privilege for those who might not always necessarily be able to access climate spaces. We like to, where we can, cover costs of travel and care costs for participants. We do collaborative work for those with limited capacity, like helping people write policy submissions and ensuring that diverse voices are in the climate space. And an important part of our project is building capacity in those communities and with the workers who work within those communities. We create workshops, materials, and webinars that feature diverse voices and experiences, and all of those materials are free to access, and we work directly with communities most impacted where we can. And so that's it from me. So thanks very much.